Step into the chaotic pages of the American Old West, where every shadow hides a gunman, and every dust trail may lead to either death or glory. In this brutal and unforgiving landscape, where men carved their names with bullets and blood, few figures walk the line between legend and ghost quite like Joseé Chavez. Born into mystery and forged in war, Chavez was not merely another outlaw in the West. He was a living enigma, feared by some, respected by others, and bound by an unwavering loyalty to those he called brothers. His story intertwines with one of the most iconic names of all, Billy the Kid, and together they etched their destinies into the scorched earth of New Mexico. But this is not just a tale of pistols and posses. This is the odyssey of a man born to a Spanish father and an Apache mother, an outsider among outsiders, who would rise from the dust of poverty and become a feared gunslinger, a vigilante, a deputy, and eventually a man haunted by the ghosts he helped create. Joseé Chavez's name is whispered with reverence and fear across the mesas and valleys of the Southwest. His life is both a symbol of rebellion and a cautionary tale of how violence, once embraced, never truly lets go. Chavez's tale is not neatly written in law books or clean historical records. It is carved into weathered headstones and carried in the oral histories of New Mexico's oldest families. His legacy was born not in government halls, but in burning houses, in courtroom betrayals, and in moonlit duels that never made the headlines. He was a man of contradictions, fighting as both outlaw and lawman, murderer and peacemaker, traitor and savior. And yet, through it all, one truth remains. Joseé Chavez was a survivor in a world that devoured its own. As we dive deeper into his life, we won't just follow the bloody footprints he left behind. We'll walk in them. From the dusty beginnings of cattle theft to the scorched finale of territorial prisons, and fading pardons, every moment of Chavez's journey echoes the chaos of a time when lawmen shot first and justice came at the end of a barrel. This is the West at its rawest, and Joseé Chavez was its beating heart. So buckle in, partner. This isn't just another outlaw story. This is the rise, fall, and rise again of Joseé Chavez, a man who rode beside legends, betrayed devils, buried kings, and in the end, found peace not at the end of a gun, but in the silence that follows when a warrior finally lays his arms down. Before the gunfights, before the headlines and history books, before the blood soaked into New Mexico's desert floor, there was only a boy, a nameless barefoot shadow running between cultures, born into two worlds that barely tolerated each other. Joseé Chavez entered life in 1851 in the forgotten town of Cebolleta, deep in the New Mexico territory. The son of a Spanish settler and an Apache woman, his very existence was a rebellion against the harsh social lines drawn by race, blood, and border. In a land where lineage determined your future, Chavez came from everywhere and belonged to no one. Little is known about his early childhood, and that silence isn't an accident. History rarely records the origins of men like Chavez, because legends are inconvenient when they are born poor. His days began with the crack of dawn and the weight of survival, working hard just to eat, scraping together what few coins he could find. He toiled as a hired hand, a ranch laborer, and at times simply a drifter. But what he lacked in wealth, he made up for in fire. Chavez was never content with the life handed to him. His eyes weren't on the soil he plowed, they were always scanning the horizon for something more. At some point in his youth, disillusionment took root. Chavez realized that honest labor could not lift him out of misery. He watched wealthy landowners grow fat on the backs of broken workers like himself. He saw how the law only protected the rich, how justice came in different tongues depending on the color of your skin. And slowly, that bitterness transformed into resolve. If the system wouldn't serve him, he would serve himself. Petty theft turned into cattle rustling. He learned how to move in the shadows, how to lie when cornered, and how to fight when outnumbered. He wasn't yet an outlaw, but the seed had been planted and it was already growing into something darker. Still, even in these early days, Chavez was not reckless. He wasn't some mindless bandit swinging pistols at anything that moved. No, Chavez studied people. He remembered every slight, every betrayal, every crooked lawman who turned a blind eye. His code was forged not from books but from hardship, and slowly his name began to travel, whispered by ranchers who lost cattle, by sheriffs who couldn't catch him, by families who locked their doors when night fell. Joseé Chavez was rising, but no one yet knew just how high he'd climb or how far he'd fall. It was during this period of restless wandering and whispered stories that Chavez caught the scent of something bigger than theft. The Lincoln County War was brewing, and New Mexico was about to explode in violence. Factions were arming up. Power was shifting. The old guard was losing its grip, and new names were rising to challenge them. Among them, a young outlaw who carried 6 bullets in his belt and a legend on his back, Billy the Kid. Their paths were destined to cross, and when they did, it wouldn't just change Chavez. It would carve his name forever into the legend of the American frontier. Joseé Chavez didn't become an outlaw overnight. No man truly does. The journey from laborer to legend is one paved with choices, desperate, violent, and irreversible. For Chavez, the decision to abandon the honest path wasn't a sudden fall, but a slow, bitter awakening. The world around him had made it clear. Survival didn't belong to the righteous, it belonged to the ruthless. And so, armed with a stolen horse, a steady hand, and a mind sharpened by hardship, Joseé Chavez crossed a line he would never return from. It began with cattle rustling in the open valleys of New Mexico. Quick jobs, smart ambushes, always moving before the law caught scent. He became a ghost in the canyons, a shadow in the mesquite. His Apache blood taught him how to track silently, how to vanish across dry land without leaving a trail. His Spanish lineage gave him the tongue to manipulate those he needed, lie when cornered, charm when necessary. He was becoming more than a thief. He was becoming a weapon. And weapons in the Wild West are either used or destroyed. By the time the Lincoln County War erupted in 1878, Chavez was no longer running from the law. He was running toward something, a cause, a name, a place to belong. New Mexico was split down the middle. On one side stood the Dolan Murphy faction, men with power, monopoly, and blood on their hands. On the other, a rising coalition of ranchers and merchants, led by John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, seeking to challenge the status quo. That conflict didn't need politicians, it needed gunmen, and Chavez, tired of running, found his purpose in the chaos. It was then he crossed paths with the man who would shape his destiny, Billy the Kid, charismatic, unpredictable, fearless. Billy wasn't just a leader, he was a magnet for misfits like Chavez. With Billy, every bullet had meaning, every shootout a message. Chavez joined the Regulators, a loose band of vigilante gunmen, hell-bent on avenging Tunstall's murder. They weren't just chasing justice, they were making war, and Chavez wasn't just part of it. He was in the thick of it. He fought beside legends, Doc Scurlock, Charlie Boder, Jim French, and of course Billy the Kid himself. He rode under the New Mexican sun with blood on his hands and fire in his chest. The Regulators became infamous, and so did Chavez. His name struck fear in shopkeepers, ranchers, even lawmen, and yet inside that fear, there was also a twisted kind of respect. Chavez wasn't reckless. He killed with precision, spoke rarely, and carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to survive for. But even as the Regulators rode high, the cost of their crusade mounted. Blood debts were paid with more blood, houses burned, allies turned into targets. On April 1, 1878, Chavez allegedly participated in the assassination of Sheriff William Brady, one of the most shocking retaliations of the war. And though he would later admit to the killing, there was no remorse in his words, only resolve. By the summer of 1879, the Lincoln County War had left a trail of bodies, burned homes, and broken alliances. But amid the ash and echo, one thing was clear. Joseé Chavez was no longer a survivor running from his past. He was now one of the most dangerous men in New Mexico, and his story was far from over. The Lincoln County War was more than just a feud between rival merchants. It was a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. Caught in the heart of it stood Billy the Kid, the most infamous name of the American frontier. And riding at his side, just as dangerous, just as determined, was Joseé Chavez. Their alliance wasn't born of brotherhood. It was forged in desperation, revenge, and survival. Two outcasts in a lawless world, they found in each other the same refusal to bow to authority, the same hunger to carve their own legacy with the barrel of a gun. As the regulators rode out across Lincoln County, Chavez became more than just a soldier. He was Billy's shadow, his confidant, a man trusted when even the law couldn't be. Together, they didn't just challenge the Dolan faction. They defied the entire structure of New Mexican power. Chavez wasn't a side character in this tale. He was a key figure in one of the bloodiest chapters of Western history, and he didn't flinch when the shooting started. On February 18, 1878, when John Tunstall was ambushed and killed by the Dolan-backed sheriff's posse, it lit a fuse that would explode across the territory. The regulators, with Chavez among them, vowed vengeance. Weeks later, they ambushed and gunned down Sheriff William Brady, riddling him with bullets in the streets of Lincoln. Chavez would later admit to participating in the assassination, not with shame, but with cold pride. This wasn't just revenge, it was war. As bullets replaced ballots and fire consumed ranches, the town of Lincoln descended into chaos. Both sides executed raids, ambushes, and assassinations. The regulators operated like a mobile militia, moving under the cover of night, slipping through desert passes and mountain trails. Chavez earned a reputation as a cold, efficient gunman, one who never wasted a bullet and never left a job half done. The final act of the Lincoln County War came in July 1878, when the McSween House, home to the last resistance against Dolan's dominance, was surrounded and set on fire. Inside were Billy the Kid, Joseé Chavez, and a dozen regulators, fighting against overwhelming odds. Smoke, heat, and gunfire filled the air, and for hours they held their ground. When the flames finally overtook the house, most inside were either burned alive or gunned down while escaping. But Billy and Chavez made it out alive, fleeing through gunfire, dodging bullets, disappearing into the desert like ghosts. This moment became mythic, a symbol of defiance, of survival against impossible odds. For Chavez, it was also the final nail in the coffin of any return to normal life. From that day forward, he would be hunted, feared, and forever remembered as a central figure in the most infamous outlaw war of the West. Yet despite the blood spilled and the lives lost, justice never truly came. The politicians washed their hands, the murderers walked free, and the legends, Billy, Chavez, and the rest, were left to drift through the ashes of a county ruined by greed and power. But Joseé Chavez didn't vanish. He rode on. Because in a world where the law was written by the rich and justice came at the end of a barrel, men like Chavez didn't disappear. They became legends. When the flames devoured the McSween house on that blistering night in July 1878, it wasn't just wood and brick that turned to ash. It was the last hope for justice in Lincoln County. The regulators, once seen as avengers, had become fugitives. And as the smoke drifted into the New Mexican sky, Joseé Chavez emerged, bloody, burned, but alive. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one carved not with banners and causes, but with survival instincts sharpened to a deadly edge. Chavez and Billy the Kid had survived the inferno. While many inside perished in a hail of bullets or beneath a collapsing roof, the two managed to slip through the chaos, vanishing into the night like shadows. Their escape wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. They had walked through fire, quite literally, and lived to tell the tale. For some, that was a sign of divine favor. For others, it was proof they were too dangerous to ever let live. In the months that followed, Lincoln became a fractured shell of its former self. Power shifted. The Dolan faction declared victory, their monopoly on commerce restored through blood and intimidation. But Governor Lew Wallace, newly appointed and determined to end the violence, sought to bring both sides to heel. He offered amnesty to any man willing to surrender, and even opened a dialogue with Billy the Kid. It was a fragile, momentary flicker of peace. Chavez, however, remained skeptical. He had seen too many promises broken, too many deals end in betrayal. The law, in his eyes, was still just a tool of the powerful. So while Billy cautiously entertained talks with Wallace, Chavez stayed low. He moved through the arroyos and canyons of southern New Mexico, a ghost with a rifle, unwilling to trust the same system that had condemned his people and his blood. By 1879, With the war officially declared over, many regulators dispersed or tried to assimilate back into civilian life. Some were killed in ambushes, others were arrested on old charges, but Chavez refused to disarm. He remained on the fringe, neither fully an outlaw nor a citizen. A man caught in between eras, watching as the Old West began its slow transformation into something more civilized, more structured, and less free. Despite the danger, Chavez was not done fighting. That same year, he briefly joined the Lincoln County Mounted Rifles, a short-lived militia assembled by Governor Wallace to enforce order. Ironically, the man who had helped burn Lincoln to the ground was now riding under the flag of the government that had failed him, but the irony was lost on Chavez. To him, loyalty was never about flags, it was about survival. Still, the experiment didn't last. The Mounted Rifles dissolved in mere months, proving as ineffective and disorganized as the politicians who formed them. Chavez faded once again into the landscape, returning to his outlaw ways, his distrust of institutions deeper than ever. Through all of this, whispers of his name continued. To some, he was a villain, a murderer who escaped justice time and time again. But to others, especially among Hispanic and Apache communities, he was a symbol, a man who stood against corruption, a fighter who refused to bow, a survivor whose scars told the story of a land soaked in betrayal. As the decade drew to a close, Chavez would continue to walk a thin line between legend and ghost. His alliance with Billy the Kid would forever define him, but he was more than just a sidekick. He was a force in his own right, a survivor of fire, a product of blood and injustice, and a name that refused to vanish into the desert wind. Because in the Old West, the law didn't write the history books. Men like Chavez did. When the guns of Lincoln finally fell silent and the air cleared from the smoke and blood that had stained the New Mexican sky, Joseé Chavez was still standing. But the man who emerged from that war was not the same youth who had once stolen cattle for survival, or rode beside Billy the Kid with a pistol on his hip and fire in his heart. He had seen too much, lost too much. And though the war had ended, the chaos within him had only begun. The 1880s brought with them a new world, one where law and politics began replacing bullets as the tools of control. But for men like Chavez, the lines between right and wrong were blurred long ago. He wandered the American Southwest like a man exiled from time, drifting between towns, hiding under aliases, and living off the remnants of a legacy that could neither be outrun nor erased. In that uncertain era, one tale stands out like a ghost story whispered in desert saloons. It was said that Chavez crossed paths with none other than Bob Ford, the man who shot Jesse James in the back. In a Las Vegas, New Mexico saloon, they were said to have agreed to a shooting match, a duel not born of hatred, but of pride. When Ford saw the calm, razor-sharp precision in Chavez's gaze and witnessed the lethal grace in the way he handled a weapon, he refused to draw. Ford, the man who killed an icon, backed away. Some said it was fear, others said it was respect, but one thing was clear. Chavez still commanded the aura of a man who had survived hell. It was around this time that Chavez did something few expected. He joined the very system he once despised, becoming a deputy sheriff. It wasn't redemption, it was strategy, to operate in plain sight, to access the law's protection while still keeping one foot in the outlaw world. But even with a badge pinned to his chest, he couldn't outrun the fire in his blood. Chavez soon aligned with Vicente Silva, a charismatic figure who led a group known as Las Gorras Blancas, the White Caps. While many Anglo settlers branded them as criminals, to the poor and landless Hispanic communities of New Mexico, they were defenders, rebels, guardians of the old ways. Chavez found in them something familiar, a cause worth bleeding for. Under Silva's leadership, he participated in operations that blurred the line between revolution and crime. Raids on wealthy landowners, protection schemes, retribution dressed as justice. But Silva's ambitions ran dark. In time, his secret society, La Sociedad de los Banditos, began to resemble the very oppressors they claimed to fight. They silenced threats, ordered killings, demanded loyalty, not unlike a criminal syndicate. Chavez, now deep within this network, saw how the war had changed, not ended. It had simply changed its face. No longer a war with open gunfights in the streets, but one waged in shadows, behind closed doors, in the dead of night. And when Gabriel Sandoval, Silva's own brother-in-law, threatened to expose them, the society made a deadly decision. Chavez and 2 other trusted men were ordered to eliminate him. The act wasn't just murder, it was a message. No one, not even family, stood above the society's will. But that murder would echo for years, unraveling the network they had built and pulling Chavez into a spiral of betrayal, paranoia, and blood. Even with the badge, even with the alliances, Chavez was still hunted by his past. Every new crime was a whisper to lawmen. Every old friend could be a snitch. And as the years passed, Chavez found himself drawn deeper into the very underworld he once sought to escape. The outlaw life wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only world that still made sense. Yet through it all there was something in Chavez that never broke. He had stood through fire, walked through war, killed, and watched his brothers die. And still, he moved forward. Not as a hero, not even as a villain, but as a relic of a time when men like him didn't need permission to make history. And history never forgot his name. What begins as loyalty can end in betrayal. And in the shadowy world of Joseé Chavez, loyalty had a price, paid in blood. As the 1890s dawned, the criminal network that Chavez had become deeply entwined with began to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. The once feared leader Vicente Silva, who ruled Las Gorras Blancas with a charismatic iron fist, was now unraveling. His paranoia grew. He saw enemies in every corner, even among his closest allies, and his orders became darker, more erratic, until they finally crossed a line. When Gabriel Sandoval, Silva's own brother-in-law, became a threat to the group's secrecy, Chavez, along with José Eugenio Alarid and Julian Trujillo, was ordered to remove him permanently. They did. The execution was swift, calculated, but what they didn't expect was Silva's next command, a horrifying twist that even seasoned killers found unthinkable. Silva ordered the murder of his own wife, fearing she would uncover the truth about her brother's fate. That was the turning point. For Chavez and the other men, it wasn't just another job, it was a signal that Silva had gone mad. They could no longer follow a man who had abandoned all reason, so they made a decision that would end one empire and birth another legend. As Silva arrived at a pre-dug grave with his wife's lifeless body in tow, Chavez, Alarid, and Trujillo turned their weapons on him. The execution was immediate, brutal, unceremonious. The once feared leader of the White Caps fell into the very grave he had prepared for his wife. 2 lives, 1 whole, justice or vengeance. History still debates, but justice always leaves a trail. And with Silva gone, the cracks in the organization widened. The walls were closing in fast. The murders could no longer be covered up. By 1894, the law caught up with the killers. Alarid and Trujillo were arrested for the murder of Gabriel Sandoval. The noose tightened, and all roads pointed toward Chavez. A $500 bounty was placed on his head, an enormous sum for the time, transforming him from shadowy outlaw to the most hunted man in New Mexico. He ran, vanished into the scrublands, moved through towns under aliases. But the desert has no loyalty. And by May 26, 1894, Chavez was finally captured in Socorro, New Mexico. The trial was swift. Witnesses spoke. Evidence mounted. And though Chavez had escaped justice time, and again this time the system held firm, he was sentenced to die by hanging, but the story didn't end at the gallows. Chavez appealed to the Territorial Supreme Court, clinging to the last threads of hope, and in an unexpected twist, his sentence was commuted to life in prison by Governor Miguel Otero, not out of mercy but public pressure. The people still whispered the name Chavez, not with fear, but with fascination. Some still saw him as a folk hero, a vigilante, a man molded by war and betrayal. And so on November 23, 1897, Joseé Chavez entered the cold stone walls of the territorial prison, inmate number 1089. He was no longer a ghost of the desert, but a prisoner of the state. For a man who had spent a lifetime defying chains, this was perhaps the cruelest twist of fate, to be caged by the same system he'd once fought against. But even behind bars, Chavez's story refused to end. He wasn't finished. He wouldn't be forgotten. Not yet. Inside the unforgiving stone walls of the territorial prison, Joseé Chavez became a ghost of the Wild West. A man who had once ridden beside legends, now reduced to a number, 1089. He had survived bullets, betrayals, and manhunts. But now, his fate rested in concrete and iron, sentenced to live out the rest of his days in a cell. The outlaw, who once roamed the dusty plains of New Mexico, feared by many and respected by few, had finally been caught, not by the law, but by time itself. Yet redemption often waits in the unlikeliest of places. In the cold silence of prison life, Chavez surprised many. He didn't resist, he didn't escape. He adapted. Over the years he became a model inmate, not out of fear, but perhaps out of a deeper sense of exhaustion. Or maybe, just maybe, he was searching for peace. He formed quiet alliances with prison guards, helped maintain order during tense moments, and when a violent uprising shook the prison walls, Chavez stepped in, not with fists or firearms, but with calm authority. He became the voice that settled chaos, the killer who saved lives. This act would not go unnoticed. By 1909, after serving just 11 years of a life sentence, Chavez's name came up once again. Not on a wanted poster, but on a petition for pardon. It was a rare gesture, and even rarer for someone with such a stained past. But Governor George Curry, moved by reports of Chavez's conduct and the pleas of those who had come to know him within those walls, granted what no one expected, a full pardon. The outlaw was free. And so, on a quiet day in January 1909, Joseé Chavez walked out of prison, not as a fugitive, but as a free man. The desert wind that greeted him wasn't the same one he remembered in his youth. The Old West was changing. The gunslingers were vanishing. The frontier towns were being swallowed by railroads and modern law. Chavez was a relic now, a living echo of a time gone by. He returned to Las Vegas, New Mexico, not with the swagger of an outlaw, but with the worn steps of a man who had seen too much. No longer driven by vengeance or violence, Chavez settled into a life of quiet reflection. He surrounded himself with a small circle of loyal friends, chief among them Librado Baca, a man who had once faced Chavez in a duel and lived to tell the tale. Their rivalry had turned into friendship, a symbol of the transformation Chavez had undergone. For the next 15 years, Chavez lived without bloodshed, no bounty on his head, no lawman at his door, just the weight of memories and the peace of finally having nothing left to fight for. He didn't seek attention, he didn't tell tales, but those who knew him spoke of a man who had made peace with his past, a man who had walked through fire and somehow emerged human. In 1924, at the age of 72, Joseé Chavez took his final breath, not in a blaze of gunfire, not in a dusty canyon or a jail cell, but in his bed under the roof of a modest home, beside the only people who had stayed with him to the end. The man who had once ridden with Billy the Kid, who had murdered and been hunted, pardoned and imprisoned, died not as a legend but as a man finally at rest.